Dr. Rob Farrow is here today, online, digital, and he is a senior research fellow in the Institute of Educational Technology at the Open University, which is the UK's national university for distance learning. I think something like the Fernuni Hagen here in Germany, if I got it right. His work explores the intersections of openness, ethics, and technology-enhanced learning, combining critical theory with applied research to address issues of equity, access, and innovation in global education. He is a keynote speaker and an internationally recognized researcher who has published widely on open education, artificial intelligence, and educational technology. And he has led numerous international projects in these areas. Yes, well, Rob, it's a pleasure for us to have you here today, and we are very excited to hear your talk. And I would say the stage is yours.
Thank you, Dankeschön. It's very good to be with you today. It is virtually. Unfortunately, I couldn't be there in person. But I hope you're having a good conference so far. And I hope this will add something to your discussions and your perspectives coming out of it today. So I'm going to be talking about the idea of an open ecosystem and what that might mean. And this is all going to be framed in terms of the Dubai Declaration on OER. Just to give you a bit more of a background on me, actually, I kind of have a connection to Frankfurt because my PhD is on German philosophy and specifically the Frankfurt School. But unfortunately, my German is just not good enough to present to you in a reasonable way. So thank you and apologies for having me speak English to you today. So my PhD is in philosophy, but I've been working as an educational technology researcher for about 15 or 16 years now at the Open University. The Open University is the biggest university in the UK. It was the first distance learning university. We have normally about 200,000 students, something like that. And I work in the Institute of Educational Technology, which is a specialist department focused on the use of technology for education. My main role is as a researcher, and my main project is the Global OER Graduate Network. I'll say some more about that in just a second. But I also have a role for the International Council for Distance Education. I'm the chair of the Open Education Network for them. And I do quite a lot of mentoring work and a lot of different connections to research projects around the world. Just briefly on GoGN, this is the Global OER Graduate Network. So this is a network of about 450 people. It's still growing quickly. We have about 200 people who are either doctoral researchers in open education, or some of them have finished their doctorates. And there's about another 250 people who are subject experts, mentors, or just friends of the network, really. Anyone can join GoGN, and if you're interested in staying in touch with open education research around the world, then you can follow the link here, or you can use the QR code. Because I'm mainly a researcher, I'm not really using OER that much in teaching and stuff like that. But I do produce quite a bit of OER through GoGN. And these resources are all available for free, obviously. They're on open licenses. And these resources are co-written in collaboration with the members to support research. And they've been downloaded many times and validated by people in all kinds of situations. So, so some things that you might find interesting there. So the Dubai Declaration on OER, which happened last year, is the latest in a sequence of high-level strategic documents which set out a roadmap for the progression of open education, open science, and so on. And increasingly, we see AI appearing in these kind of strategic documents. And in some ways, the AI aspect is the big development compared to the 2019 UNESCO recommendation on OER, which is still the kind of main strategic guide for the advancement of open educational resources. So, what does the Dubai Declaration say? It says a few things. I think one of the main ideas is the idea of OERs as digital public goods. I'm not going to say that much about digital public goods today. I think it's a good idea, obviously, but I think it's complicated in relation to AI. Um, the framing for this is still the idea of increasing access to knowledge, improving equity. But in the Dubai Declaration, there's this kind of specific idea of, okay, we need to use cutting edge technologies, especially AI, and we need to integrate them somehow into the strategy towards SDG 4. And as you'll see, there's this strong motif of the ecosystem and an ecosystem for OER, an ecosystem for open content, an ecosystem for lifelong learning, and this idea of greater harmonization and collaboration through this ecosystem idea. So if you look in the declaration, it's only like 5 or 6 pages, then ecosystem is mentioned 4 times. And the first is in relation to capacity building. And sorry, there's quite a lot of text here. There's only 2 sentences, but they're quite long. The bit about open ecosystems is down here. But essentially, the point of this part of the declaration is to say we need to make sure that people understand what happens when you use AI to and apply it to open content. And it talks about this specifically in relation to commercial services. So partly it's about encouraging commercial companies to better understand open licensing, but also for those who provide open content to understand how they can engage with people who want to use it for things like making a large language model. The second mention is in relation to access. And here the idea is that open ecosystems themselves should be promoted, and they should promote you should promote them when they prioritize digital public goods and open solutions. And there's a suggestion in here that public infrastructure should support public-private partnerships. And there's an idea here that high levels of openness can support private endeavors around emerging technologies. The third mention is in relation to sustainability. And the idea here is that for the OER ecosystem to develop properly, we need to have transparency. We need to have auditing. We need to have models of governance which are more inclusive and so on. And here, the idea of the ecosystem explicitly says it includes technologies, it includes pedagogies, and it includes law and legal systems. And then it's slightly confusing because the fourth mention is exactly the same as number 2, but in a different part of the declaration. So it's exactly the same text as the second one, but it's under sustainability. And when I looked at this, I thought for a second I was going crazy because why would they put the same thing in twice? Like, is it a mistake? I don't know, but this is what's in there. So it's exactly the same as number 2, talking about digital public goods and open solutions, and in reference to funding and knowledge management mechanisms. So that's what's in the Dubai Declaration around OER. There's obviously other things in there, but that's the ecosystem part. And what I want to do next in this presentation is first of all talk about the idea of an ecosystem as a metaphor, because you could say it's a metaphor even in the way that it's presented here. And then I want to look at it as a literal idea. So not a metaphor, meant literally. And then I'm going to try and sort of synthesize those two concepts together in some ways and offer you some critical reflections on what comes out of that. So first of all, ecosystem as metaphor. And if I ask you to think about, like, what do you think about when you think about an ecosystem? Um, you may have an idea in your mind of something. Um, I think people think of something like this, where um, there's this idea of, and the ecosystem metaphor, it has its origin in like ecology and systems theory, these kind of things. But we think of it as this kind of like nice balanced system, kind of healthy and self-sustaining. Things have a harmonious relationship and evolve together, and you get these very beautiful things in nature where things just seem to fit together because they've evolved in the same space and these kind of things. Um, and I feel like this is the idea that's being appealed to sometimes when people talk about ecosystems. It's like a good thing, right? It's a nice thing. It has a kind of normative aspect. Um, but maybe that's not the only thing about ecosystems, because there's another way of thinking about ecosystems, which is that they are places of struggle, right? They are places of conflict and competition and survival of the fittest. And we only see it as a kind of balanced system because of those processes. Some things live, some things die. You reach a balance, and ecosystems change, and over time, some things become dominant, some things don't. You can tell this picture was done with AI, right? Because the rabbit is just like floating on the water rather than being on the land. Anyway, but you get the idea, right? Ecosystem sounds nice. It sounds kind of green, kind of bio, but really it's also about conflict and survival of the fittest as well. Another thing I wanted to note about ecosystems is normally when the way that they're defined is that they have some aspects which are living and some aspects which are not. And they call this the biotic or the abiotic systems. So there's always this combination. And what you can see, I think, also from this picture is ecosystems, you can describe them as being kind of contained. So we might talk about the ecosystem in the UK or something like that. But really, they all connect to each other, right? So there's just one ecosystem at a global level, but within that, we have smaller ones. And I suppose you could say for open education, yeah, okay, there's kind of one big commons, there's one big ecosystem, but there are also these local systems which have things like specific languages or specific legal contexts and stuff like that. But they're all connected, and this is another idea of the ecosystem, I think, is connection. Um, Also, I think there are differences in scale. And so here we have things that live. Here's a good example of life and death in an ecosystem is a food chain. So sunlight is creating energy. Plants turn that into matter, which gets eaten, and so on. And things move up the chain, up the food chain. Eventually, you get to the big predators. And these things are in a balance with each other, right? And that's how the metaphor kind of works, I think. You're appealing to this idea that there's different levels within the ecosystem, things have different functions, different connections, and some things are more powerful than others, even if they are dependent on each other in some ways. Um, so that's how I understand the metaphor. Maybe you've got some different ideas about the metaphor and how to make sense of that concept of the ecosystem. I guess what I'm trying to say is here, like, it's not all nice necessarily, right? Ecosystems have losers and some people suffer, some animals suffer, and so on. So I don't think people mean that. I think people mean the idea of balance and interconnection, but I think it's important. So now moving on to like thinking about what does it literally mean then to have an open education ecosystem? So this is a different interpretation, meaning it literally is literally an ecosystem. So it's a real thing in the world, obviously. It's a real combination of different elements and different aspects. Again, you might think of different things to the things that I think of, but I'm thinking of things like policies, licenses, different kinds of technologies for discovering and storing and using OER, um, different communities, different people. Again, you have this idea of some things which are alive and some things which are not. So there's people and there's tools and technologies as well. Um, But another thing I would say is important here, which is not in the metaphor, is the idea of values, right? Ecosystems don't have values, right? They just exist. Um, but when we talk about the open education ecosystem, I think we do have values in there, and they're an important part of the real ecosystem, if I can put it that way. I want to talk for a few minutes about a project I was involved with, which ended in 2023. And this is the Encore Plus project. And here, Encore stands for European Network for Catalyzing Open Resources in Education. And this was an Erasmus Plus EU-funded project. And we had about 8 partners. And the whole idea of this project was to catalyze and speed up the uptake of open educational resources across Europe. But the reason why I want to mention it firstly is that we had this ecosystem concept all the way through this project. So I don't know if this graphic really shows it very well, but the idea was that everything's interconnected. We need to make stronger connections across different things. So we had these 4 areas: policy and practice, quality, technology, and innovation, and 5 challenges, which you can see around the outside. So lack of strategy, lack of quality paradigms, lack of technical interoperability, fragmentation of the community, and lack of innovation. And so we had this ecosystem concept right at the heart of this project. And one of the things that I tried to do as part of the research in this project was to try to map out the European OER ecosystem. And so this was done a couple of years before the Dubai Declaration. It's a bit small. I'm going to talk you through it a little bit and hopefully make sense of it. But first of all, if you can see on the left side, we have macro, meso, micro. So differences in scale, differences in size. And one of the things that I was doing when I was working on this project was I was really looking for like a stakeholder model, which you could use to map this stuff. And I didn't really find many generic stakeholder models where you would try to map a whole ecosystem, for instance, try to map everybody and how they relate to each other and that kind of thing. It's actually a pretty big challenge, I would say. So the model that we ended up with is this one, and sometimes it's known as UPIG. It's UPIG, users, providers, influencers, governance. And this is a generic stakeholder model that, again, it's a little bit difficult to see where it first came from. The earliest references I found were to do with Tony Blair's government in the 1990s. We used to use this model for stuff. That's maybe a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know. But let me talk you through it in terms of open education. So to start off with, users. So here, these would just be the people that use OER. And that's quite broad, obviously. And if you're thinking at it at a very high level, the macro level, then you have people providing training or at a national level or an international level, obviously big MOOC providers, publishing OER as part of the content of their course, and sort of very, very high level open education initiatives. At the meso level, companies and employers, lifelong learning providers, training providers, not really schools and universities, so I would count more like a micro, um, where you would have institutions and the people who are working within the institutions. So there's another question here about, even if you change the scale, what's the granularity? Is the granularity a university or the people that work inside the university? And just as with the food chains for ecosystems, you get very, very, very small, right? The things that are getting eaten get smaller and smaller the further you go down the food chain. And so there's a question there around the granularity, which I think is quite a challenge. The next category moving across is providers. So in this example, it would be the people who provide OER. So you have things like repositories, you have open access publishers, you have galleries and museums and archives, people working on their own, artists, libraries. At the very big level, you have the big infrastructure providers, technology providers, ed tech companies. And there are some people that kind of sit in the middle of these as well, right? So repositories are users of OER and also providers of OER. And I think publishers exist all the way across the scale. So you have very small publishers, very big publishers. There's lots of stuff that you can say, right, with this, trying to catch everybody that's part of this. The third category is quite an interesting one, and it's influencers. And here, influencers doesn't mean people with a TikTok account. It means people who have an influence over what is happening. So that could be at a very high level, it could be government making policy, it could be funders, it could be development agencies and these kind of things. At the more medium size, quite a big group. And I think this in some ways is the most overlooked group, is the influencers, because a big issue with open education is awareness and people not knowing about OER, not knowing about the possibilities of OER. And there's all these professional associations, labor organizations, trade unions, charities, disability groups, all these kinds of people that are very important potentially in terms of being able to influence people and raise awareness of OER. The final category is governance. And this really just means people who have a role in setting rules and regulations and enforcing the rules and regulations. And with it in between the two, again, policymakers, they have influence, but they're also governance. You have leaders at every level of these things. So obviously you could spend a lot longer going through all the possible people that could be in your OER ecosystem. And you may have a different approach towards this. One limitation of this model is it doesn't really tell you how these people interact with each other. And the interaction seems to be a really important part of the ecosystem, I would say. So this is not a perfect piece of work, right? It was done within the context of a project, but it's the most comprehensive attempt I know of to try to describe who is in the ecosystem. How do they relate to each other? What different roles do people have? I would also just note that the Dubai Declaration is asking us to be an ecosystem, but we've never really mapped out exactly who's in this ecosystem. Should we include commercial publishers? Are they part of this ecosystem? It's an interesting question. I just want to highlight here the OER World Map as a place where you can potentially see the infrastructure for yourself. Maybe this is the open education ecosystem. Again, you can't capture everything, but we can capture quite a lot. We can understand what's going on and how the interactions are happening. So that's maybe a literal interpretation of like, what is the OER ecosystem? I don't think anyone's got a perfect view of it. Let me try now to just kind of bring those two concepts together a little bit. So we have from the metaphor, the idea of openness as this living, adaptive, evolving system, which has human and non-human aspects. Sometimes this idea of an ecosystem is called kind of an operating logic. It's a way of behaving as opposed to an industrial system or something like that. And it's been quite popular in terms of digital culture and that kind of thing to talk about ecosystems. And when we talk about it literally, we're talking about real networks, infrastructures, actors, processes, and these kind of things. Maybe it sounds obvious, but hopefully like this is clear. So the question then is, okay, if we're trying to create this ecosystem, does it mean we just leave everything alone and everybody acts selfishly almost and chaotically, and we trust that order will arise from the chaos the way that it does in nature? And if on the left hand here, this is again, these pictures are not perfect in terms of what they're trying to explain, but on the left side is the idea of a wild environment, no rules, you just let it happen. And on the right side, it's more like the idea of a garden with a wall around it. And we say, okay, we can control what happens inside this wall in these walls. And it's a bit more like a garden of a big castle or something. And so which of these are we trying to create with open education? I think it's a really interesting question. And it actually reminded me a bit of this book, The Cathedral and the Bazaar. And if you don't know it, this is originally it's a book about open source software development. But the one of the ideas is the in medieval times, building a cathedral is something that took massive organization and lots of people working together with one plan. And by doing that, they could create something very complex and impressive. And the analogy would be something like Microsoft Windows or something like that, where yeah, it's all happening behind a wall, but they're building something very complicated and it has to be done in a certain way. Compare this with the bazaar. So the bazaar is like the big marketplace where everybody goes and there's not really any rules, right? Everyone's just kind of acting within there. They kind of make their own rules. But again, some order arises from that. This would be like the wild environment. And I guess, and so the idea of software development is you can do open software development where lots of people get to check it and stuff like that, rather than you do it behind closed doors and you have a very specific plan that everyone is working to. So one question is, how much are we trying to control the ecosystem rather than just acting within it? And I think this is an interesting tension within the declaration. If we go back to the mentions of the ecosystem in the declaration, the first one is about open content ecosystems interacting with commercial AI services which respect open licensing. Now, you might say, is that realistic, right? Is it realistic that we expect generative AI, especially private companies, to respect open licensing? I mean, it hasn't been happening so far, right? Um, and in the Dubai Declaration, it's framed as a kind of training capacity building requirement. The idea that, well, if people were just trained better, then we wouldn't have this problem. We wouldn't have the problem of AI companies just taking things and not really respecting open licenses, right? They don't even respect copyright. So why would they respect an open license? Here's an example of the guy from Microsoft. If it's on the web, it's fine to take it and do what you want with it. Similar example, the chief technical officer from OpenAI was asked, what are you training your LLMs on? And she just said, oh, it's public data, publicly available data. It's copyrighted data scraped from the internet. So there's not much indication here that companies have any interest in respecting open licensing. So it's kind of an interesting way that it's phrased in the declaration, almost as a kind of like a knowledge problem, like you just don't understand open licensing. But you also have to care about open licensing as well. The second one we looked at is all about finding ways to support private initiatives using AI, sorry, using OER to support emerging technologies like AI. But they have to adhere to the principles of digital public goods and high levels of openness. So again, you could say, well, if you're a private company and your main motivation is profit, why would you be interested in digital public goods? Why are you interested in openness? Maybe you like openness when it benefits you because you can take some content or something like that. But I think there are some unanswered questions about how that's supposed to work. The third example is all about transparency across the OER ecosystem. And the idea here was, yeah, we have to build trust by showing transparently what's happening, how people are using these things, and so on. That's difficult, right? It's difficult to have an auditing process with generative AI because things go into the black box, something else comes out. Most of the time, no one really knows what's happening within the black box. So how could it be transparent? Also, you could say, well, private companies maybe don't have much motivation to share everything about what they do because part of competitive advantage is that other people don't know what you're doing necessarily, right? That's how competition works. So I don't know really what to call these kind of ideas. Maybe they're tensions, right? Maybe they are optimism or something, or maybe naivety. Um, but the idea is, repeatedly is this ecosystem has to involve the private sector. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing necessarily, but I suppose I am questioning the coherency of some of this stuff. Um, and don't get me wrong, digital public goods are a good thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. Um, but AI really poses us some problems, which I think maybe the Dubai Declaration, it kind of makes it, smooths it over, makes it go away, maybe a little bit too quickly. But loads of people in the open education space are very interested in this combination, right? ChatGPT or some other GPT for open educational resources. And prominent people in the movement, including people like David Wiley, Stephen Downes, Martin Dugiamas, they've endorsed AI as the logical next step to widen participation in education. And it's easy to see why, right? Because you've got all these new possibilities for creating, translating, and localizing educational resources um, more cheaply and more efficiently. And that's very attractive. And also, I guess, like, you can't pretend that these technologies don't exist. Maybe we could hope for a little bit better from the regulators, but at the moment, this is the way that things are going. If you look at the one of the best known AI companies, OpenAI, it's pretty interesting, right? That they've got open in front of their name. OpenAI is currently valued at $500 billion. They're currently paying 1,000 employees, one point, what was it? $1.5 million each just to stay with the company because Meta, who owns Facebook, is offering them $100 million to move from OpenAI to Meta. $100 million just to change your job. Um, it does feel a bit like they've got too much money, right? And it feels a bit like the the bubble may be about to burst when they're throwing around these kind of numbers. There was a report from MIT, I think it was last month, which said 95% of companies that are using AI are seeing no benefit, right? They're not saving money, they're not really being any more efficient. Obviously, people are investing in it, but they're not necessarily seeing a benefit from that. Um, what does it mean to be open as an AI company? There was an interesting study published last year all about generative AI systems and ways to measure how open they are. And so what you're looking at in this grid is across the top, we have different ways in which you could measure openness. So things like, is the data open? Are the training weights open? Is it on an open license? Is there documentation? Is there an API? All these kind of things. And if you're not a technical person, basically it just means how much is shared about what happens with this AI system. And they ranked all of them. I think there's about 20 or 30 of them that were looked at. Um, Now, have a guess which is the least open. If we go right down to the bottom, it's ChatGPT. And I mean, ChatGPT technically doesn't claim to be an open system. It's just called from a company called OpenAI. Um, Most people are kind of surprised when they see this, right? But I think it's an example of open washing. And open washing, if you don't know, is the idea of calling yourself open as a kind of brand because it's got like a positive connotation, a positive association. And you get similar things with greenwashing for environmentally friendly stuff and pink washing um, for like pride and this kind of thing. Um, all of a sudden, companies like to promote themselves in whichever way, they think will make sense to their audience. And so sometimes they use open as the idea, and people call this open washing. Um, and so there's some pretty clear examples of this. And you can see how, if we're thinking in terms of the Dubai Declaration and how we make these connections between private sector interests and public infrastructure, it's quite easy for a company to say, yeah, we're open. We're open. We publish, our findings. We publish papers, and um, we use open source software and these kind of things. But it doesn't really mean anything. And we need a better idea and a better definition for what it means to use AI in an open way, I would say. There is a newly published definition of open source AI, which you can find at this address. I will send the slides on to the organizers afterwards in case you don't get a note of this right now. So some things are happening, but the question is, are they happening quick enough before everything is already captured, I suppose? There's a really interesting book called Anatomy of or Atlas of AI. And there's a companion website called Anatomy of AI. And this is by Kate Crawford. And what it tries to show is the real system behind an AI service. So in this case, it's a bit too small, right? You can't really see. But what it will do is it shows you, okay, it uses the example of an Amazon Echo speaker here. And there's all these different materials like rare metals, different minerals, all these things that have to be mined. There's all of the training for the moderation for the algorithms. A person has to do that. And in both cases, that's normally a poor person in a poor part of the world, completely hidden from you as the user of that system. There's also the energy and water costs associated with AI and data centers. I think it takes something like 360,000 gallons of water per day to cool a data center. So there's all this kind of environmental impact, but social impact as well. Unacknowledged labor, stuff that's completely hidden from you as the user of an AI system. Um, but maybe this is partly what we can use the ecosystem idea to explore, because it lets us understand that this is connected, right? It's not separate. All of these ecosystems are connected, even if we only think in terms of our local ecosystem most of the time. Another thing I want to just quickly mention here is the idea of um, pollution of our information space. And what I mean by that is increasingly people are just creating things which then enter the public uh, internet, and then they get used to train other AIs again. And sometimes people call this like the incursion problem, but basically we're just creating a lot of shit, right? Um, and then we're kind of using that, and it's making our systems worse and worse and worse. And some people have compared this to the idea of like microplastics. So microplastic pollution is everywhere. You can't avoid it anymore. It's in everything, food that you eat, the water you drink, and this kind of thing. And so there's a worry here that because we're going too quickly with some AI stuff, we're going to end up making our own information ecosystem worse. And I think that's something to be aware of with regards to some of these, to applying AI without necessarily understanding fully what its long-term effect might be. I'm going to start wrapping up now. Maybe there's a bit of time for discussion. Just a few reflections to end with. It can feel a bit like you're not really going to be given a choice, right, with AI. No one's really able to say, no, I don't want AI. I don't really want it in my life, because it's coming everywhere. Students are using it. It's coming into your Microsoft Office. It's coming into your social media. And it can feel a bit like you're not really given a choice, right? It's either go fast or go even more fast, because there's no stop and there's no slow down. And this is something that you see from governments, from big companies. It's everywhere. And it's in the Dubai Declaration too. Um, but again, no one's necessarily shown that we need it, right? But we're not really being given that much of a choice. And part of the reason I mentioned that, and I'm not sure if my friend and collaborator Marcus is there with you today. I think he was supposed to be there today. Um, Marcus and I recently contributed to this book released in association with Digital Learning Week for UNESCO. And what we do in there is try to sort of characterize the idea of the education space in relation to AI in terms of ideology. And what you can see from this slide is, I mean, even though we just say AI all the time, AI means lots of different technologies. But even within that, there's different interpretations of what is it for, right? And so some people have this quite utopian idea. Oh, this is the way to solve all of society's problems, including education. And maybe the Dubai Declaration is a little bit similar to this. It will just say, yes, of course, we need to use this, and this is the David Wiley sort of position, the Stephen Downes position. Of course, we must use AI to achieve our goals of greater equity and greater opportunity in education. But not everyone thinks like that. And there are some pretty kind of crazy ideas about AI as well. And that can be about having a society which is under full surveillance, or market fundamentalism, or techno-feudalism, or these different ideas about, what the future might look like with regards to AI. And I mentioned this really from the point of view of, if an ecosystem is about greater harmonization and greater coordination, if we don't all share a vision for what's supposed to be the end result, how is that supposed to happen? Isn't it going to be a bit more like there's a survival of the fittest of these ideas? And we'll have to see which one of them ends up being the dominant use of these technologies. Maybe you see it differently, but I think there is still this kind of contested space around the point of AI and why we're interested in it in the first place. Who's it serving? And I guess also I want to say, is it really compatible with the values of open education? If there's no respect for intellectual property, for instance. And I'm aware there's a debate around, training AIs is not the same thing as publishing copyrighted material and that kind of thing. So I'm aware of that, but I still think there's some unresolved tensions there. But we need this definition of what it means to be open as an AI. You may have some different ideas about what openness means. I think to me, it's about placing a value on sharing and collective improvement, foregrounding transparency, centering questions of equity and ethics, and pedagogy in educational technology. But when we put that word open in front of things, that's what it means, right? It's what it means to me anyway. And it means transparency and pluralism and participation. And my kind of definition around openness, I think, is that you have to acknowledge that it's a political concept. It's not just a technical protocol. It's about promoting the kinds of critical literacies that ask who's benefiting from these technologies, whose voices are being silenced, what are we assuming when we design technologies for education? And I think open approaches which are authentic encourage the formation of communities of practice and working across disciplines, working across institutions, working across ecosystems to try to put forward the values of openness, which can be realized in different ways, maybe in different circumstances. So I think it's really important to get that kind of openness into our interpretation of the Dubai Declaration. I just want to say I've explored ecosystems as a metaphor in this presentation. If you're interested in AI metaphors in education, you might want to have a look at this recent special issue of the Journal of Interactive Media and Education. I'm one of the editors, which is all about different metaphors and how they've been used in recent discourse. And that's the end of my presentation. Thanks so much for listening.